Hello, AVPA Music Media students. This is Ian here. I'm talking to you from my home studio, and I just wanted to reach out to you guys and let you guys know how we're going to be running the class for the next few weeks for the remainder of the spring semester through the end of the school year. So how this is going to work, it's going to work in two parts. We're going to have these pre-recorded lessons where I go through a concept or show an example of things I'm working on, or answer your questions virtually. These lessons will be available on either my YouTube channel or the AVPA Media Music YouTube channel. I haven't decided which yet, but I will let you know as soon as I decide. And these will exist for you guys to review at your own convenience, at your own time, on your own schedule, after you do the other work that's already been assigned to you by your other classes. It's important that you do the other distance learning that's assigned to you. This is just extra stuff on top of it. So I hope you take it seriously, but it cannot happen. It cannot be the only thing that's happening on top of your other work that you're required to do. So we're going to have those. And then also, starting next week, I hope, maybe the week after, but hopefully next week, we will have a weekly Q&A session where we just do 1 hour, only 1 hour of me answering your questions that you might have from the recorded lesson, or that you might submit to me via email. So today, for example, at the end of this, I will address a question that your classmate Max asked about using chord trigger patches. So we'll come back to that later. So please, if you have any questions, let me know. I hope you're all still finding ways to be creative and work on things. I hope that you're not just watching Netflix all day after you finish your distance learning. And if you are watching TV, which is fine, or consuming media, please always keep in mind that you should be analyzing what you're watching and asking why you're watching it, and asking what the people who created it did to make that piece of media come alive at all aspects, not just the music and sound, but everything that goes into it. So you should always be thinking about that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through kind of the setup I use here at home. I know lots of you have had questions about that. And then we're also going to go through the this piece I did this last weekend for the 48-hour Stuck at Home challenge. So before we jump into this, I want to explain how the setup works here at home. So I have 4 computers in my house, but to do music production, I use 2 at a time. And there's one Apple computer, which you're seeing here, with Logic and Pro Tools and Cubase and all the creative stuff. And then there's another server PC, which has all of my samples and holds my virtual instruments. And the reason why I use 2 computers, like I've talked about in class, is you get a lot more mileage, you get a lot more power when you split it up. So, these Spitfire audio sounds, they sound fantastic, and I love using them, but they use a lot of CPU power. So when I use just a PC, I'm able to have a PC use almost all of its RAM just to hold these sounds. And then it frees up my Logic computer just to run Logic and all of the fun stuff we have going on in here. So all of these plugins, all of these channels, all these creative stuff. So that's kind of how I work. I use this computer you're looking at here is a 2018 Mac Mini computer. It's just one of their desktop computers. And then this is a Vienna PC that was given to me by a mentor of mine named Michael Malo. So thanks to Michael for that. And yeah, so basically what you're seeing here is a score suite. You guys all know by now that I like to just write music freely whenever I start a project. And sometimes, like on a film like this is the final score. There was no time for re-recording or for cueing the picture, scoring the picture. It's just they take the music and edit it for the film. That's the way a lot of people work these days, and I'm more than happy to work that way. So how my session is organized, I change my sounds a lot, but even when I use Cubase, there's a general similarity in how things are organized for all my sessions, and I've kind of been doing it this way for quite a while. So at the top here, I am using this piano as an effect, but at the top here, there is a piano track, and this is really where a lot of the music is written. But it also, in this piece, it's actually being used in the composition as a kind of a drone with all these different effects on it. sure that's a little hard to hear, so let me just turn that up. So I'm actually using this piano as an effect in the piece, which you'll hear in 1 second. And then this is kind of what my session actually looks like when I'm gonna write music. So I actually have all these folders closed. I actually find it very overwhelming to have tons of tracks open when I'm trying to come up with an idea or a concept. So everything is really closed, and usually for quite a while, if it's a more orchestral leaning, it's just a piano track and these orchestral multis. An orchestral multi-sample is a sample where multiple elements are combined. So this is a sample of an entire orchestra playing. And you can do short notes, long notes, and you can also do short notes. So you can do longs, and this just kind of helps you build your ideas. And so I usually start here, and the theory is that you can kind of sketch an idea for yourself and see if it works with or without picture before you commit to the very, very intense process of sequencing everything and orchestrating everything and producing everything. So I really like working in this kind of top-down format. So then I just have my woodwinds. So this orchestral multi is actually a small version of everything you see here. So as you can see, the woodwinds are on top, just like they are here in the bigger session. And these are just ensembles. So, and you can basically, on a more traditional piece, you could basically sketch the whole thing out just up here. And it doesn't sound perfect. You don't have as many articulations and choices, but it's good enough just to see if an idea is going to work. So before you spend the time orchestrating this part for all the brass, you can just see if it's going to work on these 2 tracks. So let's make sure these are both on longs. So you can kind of just sketch out your ideas. So you can just try things out. You can just try things out and see if it works for you or not before you go in here and actually do very detailed work on every track. So that's how I like to work. Sometimes these things can get muted. I try an idea and it doesn't work, but I leave it there as reference, or other times it stays in here and becomes part of the whole production. And then after that, we have our woodwinds, brass, harp, and these are just like normal orchestral templates. I have empty tracks hidden, so I can just load up more patches if I need to. But that's how I like to work. So these are things I always like to have, and then I leave some empty spaces for project-specific sounds. I think one thing that I've been trying to do is I've been trying to simplify my setup. So I only let myself use 1 contact per section now. I don't use 3 or 4 or 5 anymore, and it makes life a lot easier just doing it this way. So usually an idea starts here, and then it starts to make its way down here. On the opposite end of things can also start as just synthesizers, and then I start doing more of the orchestral or electronic percussion stuff later. We've talked a lot about being organized. I highly recommend that you consider organizing your sessions this way, and figuring out a system that works for you. Everyone has a different way that they like to work, but it's worth figuring a workflow that helps you create things. So for this piece, for this short film this year, the 48-hour film festival is a fun kind of challenge where multiple people, teams come together and they're assigned a topic, and then they have to come up with the whole film in like 2 days. Usually I work remotely, like I almost always do, because it's hard to move this whole setup somewhere else. Even though I do have a laptop studio, it's only so powerful. But basically, so this year everyone had to work remotely, so it led to some interesting creative choices. So the film I worked on is a film called Memento or Bust. I will include a link to it for you guys to check out. The music was taken from the suite and edited to picture by the film's creator, Arnold and Andrea. and I've worked with the two of them a lot. This is probably our 10th or 11th collaboration, and it was a lot of fun. So for this piece, I think the goal was to kind of have a sense of dread and to create a lot of space for dialogue. There's voiceover almost the whole time, so how you can do that is just by having lots of repetition and not going too crazy. So that's what I chose to do. So to start this project, instead of starting up here like I just said I often do, I actually pulled out one of my actual real synthesizer, an analog synth, and I just started recording some phrases here. So this was kind of where the score started. So just ideas like this. And I built the whole composition using these. So this is what the synth sounds like on its own, right into the computer, and then you start processing it. So it starts to become more of a percussion sound, more of a production sound. So that's kind of the basis of this piece. It's a D sharp drone with a C sharp in there. And then one of my favorite things to do is to make percussion out of synthesizers. So this is, you can just generate noise with synthesizers, and this is just synthesized percussion noise with processing on it. So with no processing, this is what it sounds like. And what's cool about using an analog synth, even though this is the same synth, you can hear each of those hits was a little different. And that's because it's creating the content every time you use the synth, whereas a digital sample is going to be the same sound over and over again. So you can actually see how each waveform is a little different, and that's kind of what makes analog synthesis quite beautiful. So here, when we start having quarter notes, you can start to see how each one is a little different, and I think that's why people like using analog synths so much. I was kind of a digital-only guy for a long time, but just using a little bit is actually really cool, and it adds a lot of feel to the piece. And you might notice that these are right on the grid, so how you can quantize audio, because I just played it in, I didn't actually have MIDI going in and out for this stuff, is you can click on your region here, like we've talked about, and you go to flex time, and you go to rhythmic, and you can actually use quantize like you do on MIDI tracks, and quantize it to the grid, which is very important. You don't need to quantize everything, like melodic lines and stuff, but for rhythmic stuff like this, I think it's really essential to have it locked on the grid. And the reason why is because I'm using delays on this to create an effect. So so EQ goes on everything. But then I'm also using this delay plugin in a creative way to create lots of motion. And you can use any delay, but you're creating rhythms with the delay plugin. And this is something I learned from Robert Leiderker. He likes to do this a lot, the composer on Sleepy Hollow, and it's a cool way to add lots of motion to your track. And I think it adds lots of tension. So one of the things I was asked for by the filmmakers was to kind of have a continuous build throughout the piece. And I think it does that. And what's cool about the delay, it starts to repeat on itself, and it sounds quite beautiful. So this is how I build a lot of my tracks. So right now, this is what the track started out at. This is just these two elements. And keeping in mind the idea that we're trying to create lots of tension and stress for the audience. So that's what this sounds like. So for quite a while, the track was just this. Then I kind of created this little drone sound using the analog synth again. You can see there's a lot of plugins being used on this. So this is what the sound sounds like. Nothing too really not a lot special about that. It sounds cool, but I think using the plugins as a composition tool really starts to transform it quite a bit. Right, so I experimented with this filter plugin. I ended up not liking it, but I did use this one a lot, which is very fun. So this tunes up the note an octave, and then you can mix back in with the regular signal. So here's the original sound. Here's what that turned in there. It's a lot of fun. And then I think I used the delay. So the delay is kind of giving it some space. If you listen closely, you can hear how that changes the way it sits in. And then I have Pan Man, one of my which if you have headphones on, you can hear it moving left to right, subtly. But using panning tools like that can help you have a little sound like this sit well with, 50 or 60 other sounds. So that's always fun. So basically, our composition for quite a while, for probably maybe 2 or 3 hours, this is all it was. It was a repetitive drone with noise percussion and an octave riff on top of it. And this is actually one of my favorite ways to do electronic scores. You're just kind of creating an atmosphere and you're getting a feeling going. And then you, and that's one of the fun things about playing an actual instrument to the DAW. Like analog synthesis, this didn't take very long to create these unique sounds. Whereas if you're only using samples and you have to look through a sample library like Omnisphere or something, and you're not making the sounds, you have to spend a ton of time trying to find sounds. And I actually don't like doing that. I find that it takes more time than just making a sound. And that's just my style preference. I think making sounds is one of my strengths. And I just try to make my own stuff whenever I can. And it just, there's no right way to do any of this. It's more fun for me when I make my own sounds. And I think it helps me tell the filmmaker story better that way. So after that, the piece starts to grow a little bit. So we have our live audio stuff down here. And then we start having more of these synthesized parts. I actually think before I break this whole thing down, I'm going to play the whole piece start to finish, and then we can talk about it from there. So just keep in mind that this whole composition started with these live samples of my own, and it was able to become a whole composition that was used in a film in about half a day. I think I worked on this for about 6 hours. So this is about 6 hours of work or so, and maybe a couple hours a day before kind of playing around with some sounds and testing things out. But so let's just take a listen to this from the top, and we will break down some more of the composition elements afterwards. So that drone that started the piece just finally came in. there's that noise percussion we used. All right, so that's the whole piece. That the whole score is based around this, and part of that is that they have to work really fast. So the inspiration for this score was, Clint Mansell's Requiem for a Dream. That's really what the filmmakers were after, and David Julian's score for Memento, which is more the perspective I approached it from, and also the I think. I always think about the score, but I think it has a new popular place in popular culture now. But I am a huge Cliff Martinez fan, and I often think about his scores for both Driving and Contagion and on almost any electronic music project I work on, and his score for Neon Demon 2, and the It Follows score by Disaster Piece. So those electronic scores are some of my favorites, and I try to let myself be inspired by them as much as I can. And just, a lot of the more minimal kind of electronic producer guys in general. So the goal with this is, this whole score is designed to have lots of stress and dread in it. And I think that's accomplished through it being repetitive and through just creating an atmosphere rather than creating big themes. And the reason why we don't have big themes is, one, this film is about 3 minutes long. It is almost all voiceover, and we're just trying to add emotion to that voiceover and not distract from it. So, after back to the build of this piece, after all of the analog stuff here was done, I started to add these synthesizers in the synthesizer folder. So let's just keep this area on loop, on cycle. So this is what the piece starts out as. So we have our starship sound, which is very fun. So it's some drones, some sub bass, or one. So this is kind of the structure of the whole piece. I think a really important sound in this whole piece, going into the digital realm, is this. This is actually just an alchemy sound that I played around with and did some work on. It's a modular sound, but this arpeggiated sound is a really big part of this piece. and there's lots of processing going on. So the sound coming from Alchemy sounds like this. It's okay, but you know, distort it a little bit, kind of turn it up, really starts to become really powerful. And plus these drones. So this is actually a guitar patch that I made for an independent film that's actually kind of happy. I made this as a synth programmer for a fellow composer named Robert Mai, and the patch on its own is actually quite pretty. Alright, now without this EQ on, it's actually much brighter. But I made it dark and a horror film, so. And how you do that, distortion can kind of do that to any sound. So I enjoy taking pretty sounds and kind of tearing them apart. And then we have one of my massive sounds. I've over the last couple years have built a very big massive library for myself, and I still use the original Massive. I don't really have an interest in Massive X, so it's just kind of this idea that if I'd rather have a few tools I use all the time and know very well than have every single synth on the market and be using presets. I don't get it, so it doesn't work for me. So yeah, so this is the digital synth portion of the piece. This is kind of the gist of the piece. There's another important sound that comes in right here. This is another guitar sample I made for my friend Robert Mai. It's actually much prettier for the film. So the sample originally sounded like this. It's meant to be like a rhythmic tool. But I decided to use it as kind of a scary tool. So this is the sample with no processing on it. This is with a healthy amount of processing on it. Excuse me, wrong channel here. So that's the original sample. And then this is with the fun stuff added onto it. So it's distorting but not clipping, which is cool. This is like a rhythmic drone, so it just, I think, increases tension throughout the piece. The sound right here is a good example of taking a preset and really transforming it with the use of plugins. So this is the sound out of Alchemy. And there's already quite a bit of processing going on just in here with these crossfade tools, but when you start processing it, it starts to become something else. And once again, I'm using a delay to spread it around the stereo space, and it adds a lot of stress, I think, which is cool. I really enjoy that sound. So basically, the heart of this score lies in the synthesizer tracks. So if we just listen to the third act's synthesizer tracks, this is what we have going on. I actually have spent a lot of time making these rhythm tracks. I know it's all D sharp, but kind of getting the balance right and getting the timbre correct with all these different plugins actually can take quite a while. So that's kind of how that goes. And this is where I spent a lot of the time. So then, because it's cinematic, and we have to remember Requiem for a Dream was one of the references, we start adding kind of strings back in. So the strings are here to kind of add a bigger flavor to the piece. And this is just the string section. So, all right. So let's move into more of the orchestral parts. So, so just to review, we have our piano and synth tracks. This is kind of the first thing that happened in this piece. So this piece just existed as these elements for probably a couple hours. And we're just trying to establish a tone. Alright, so after that structure is built, I went into here, into my orchestra multis, and when I do orchestra parts, I like to work top down. So you get the idea going in just one big string patch that has all your strings, and then you can expand on it in these other folders as needed. And I find that that's a much simpler way to work when you work by yourself like I do on most projects. It is important to note that there was another composer on this project. My friend Roland Bingaman did some nice work on some of the other keys. He did some of the more happy stuff, and I just did all the dark stuff, which is kind of how it works on the films I work on. So, so this is the first string track that was done. So probably shouldn't be panned all the way left like that. That happens sometimes. So keeping in mind they wanted to have some strings, sort of in the style of Requiem for a Dream. So this is what it started as. I like to do all the parts here. So this is, I know you're hearing cellos, but this is basically a viola part, violin 2, violin 1. And then once you get the piece going on just one ensemble patch like this, you can just copy paste what you need onto these other violin tracks down here. And it saves a lot of time. So just did this first. So we have this string part with our synthesizer tracks. And this is kind of how this piece is built up. So this is where we're at with this piece. So the reason why I like to use one string patch with everything on it is just with this one string patch playing with two hands, I'm able to see if this string part compositionally is working before I spend the time expanding on it and fleshing out the piece as a producer. So this is like the first pass of the strings. That feels pretty good. So after that, I expand on the strings some more. So I add some low strings, plus the synthesizer tracks that we've already heard. And the reason why I'm showing you this way is just to show you, kind of give you insight into how people build tracks. So do one string pass. And the reason why I'm able to work fast on this is because at the start of the video I went through how I was building the foundation with those analog synths, and once you build that foundation on a droney piece like this, you can just expand on it using a few tracks. So just using this orchestral multifolder, we know that this feels really good and that these string parts are going to work. So the next step is to start thinking like a producer, and let's get some separation here. So then I take all of these, remember I did a viola, violin 2, and violin 1 part. So I take all of these MIDI regions, I copy them, and I start to split up the piece. So we actually build another string section down here. So the viola part sounds like this. So we have our basses playing our root notes with cellos and octaves. We have our viola part playing the first part of that riff. We have our violin parts. And I'm just going to play you, these are section samples. So they sample multiple people at one time. So this is our ensemble strings. These are the ensemble string, excuse me. So when we add those back with our multi-strings, start to get this really big sound. Very cinematic. And very fun. And there's one last trick I'll show you in 1 second with your strings. Then we add in solo patches. So these solo patches actually don't sound too great on their own. But here's why. A solo patch is sampled very intimately, and it adds a lot to the piece. So if you hear this on its own, you'd be like, wow, that's kind of not so great. But watch what happens when you bring it back. Alright, so these are just the solo strings. And you can see that those are very tight. But with samples, when you use tight short notes and long short notes and medium short notes all combined, it actually starts to sound like humans playing. Because even if you have the best players in the world, no violin or viola section plays perfectly in time. So when you use multiple sample libraries, you can sort of emulate that. So here's all of our strings combined together into one kind of force. And this is what I do for most of my scores. It kind of disguises what libraries you're using, and it just starts to sound really emotional and really cinematic and fun. So you can see how weighty and big that feels, but not overly loud. Right? It sounds very big, but we still have lots of headroom. So gain staging is very important. So you can see we have lots of headroom. We're just creating a big sound through medium volume layers. So we have our strings going. So basically this piece up until this point is strings and synthesizers. And I actually will often do percussion near the end. I don't know why that happens, but that's just kind of how it works. So this is what this piece was at the biggest point. So that's pretty cool, right? But how do we make it more cinematic, you know? When you know people are going to edit to your music, it's good to give them rhythmic things that they're going to hit to. So the filmmakers told me that they were going to have lots of quick cuts. So I decided to put in some drum hits here to kind of add to that. One of my favorite sounds in the world is an 808 kick drum. And this is what it sounds like with that in there. So this piece is already, you're hearing almost every single part now. Alright, so that's basically the whole composition. And then at the end, I like to add in some more kind of production candy. So this is a sub drop like you would hear in an EDM track on top of everything else. That's basically the whole piece at its peak. There's some other elements we'll go into in a little bit. Remember, this foundation that we started at the beginning is present throughout the whole piece, and it serves as kind of an anchor for all of our MIDI programming work. Alright, so here, this part of the piece, this is more of like a tension thing. You want to kind of give filmmakers, if they're going to be editing your music to a film, I like to give them things with various energy levels. So let's say our energy levels are 1 out of 10. This over here is like a 10 out of 10. It's like a lot going on. Alright, and that's fun to produce music like that, but in most film contexts, that's only usable for so long. So I find that giving lots of atmospheric stuff like this is actually gets more mileage in the project, and it actually does a better job of serving the story in most cases, because there are so many other elements going on. You always have to remember that sound in a film is the score, sound effects, and dialogue. The three of those have to exist together. They cannot be conflicting. So doing stuff like this that's just repetitive and might not make sense compositionally or even be that enjoyable to listen to, I think is actually really beneficial for helping to tell the cinematic story you have going on. So just the same way that I was building the string tracks with multiple layers, I do that with my percussion tracks. So this could totally work as just one track. The composition idea would be felt and heard. So if I just had my kick drum and these taikos, you would get the feeling that I intend as a composer, and that's cool. But when you add one more taiko sample on the other side of the stereo spectrum, you start to get a much more cinematic sound. And when you're hearing samples, you're hearing all these round robins. So a round robin is when you record the same sample, 4 to 8 or 12 times. And when you use 2 patches, now you have twice the amount of round robins going on. Not per patch, but collectively. And what that does is it creates a much more natural kind of sound, and it's harder for your listeners to pick up that those are samples. Even in the biggest films you watch, there's lots of samples, and there's nothing wrong with that. But how you use them musically and tastefully plays a big role in how your audience perceives what they're watching and listening to. And there's lots of distortion on the drums too, so that it's kind of a Hans Zimmer, Alan Meyerson trick to put distortion in your drums, but it just makes everything a little bit more fun when there's distortion on the drums. So, distortion on the kick drum, distortion on the epic percussion. So, very fun. And once again, the same thing with the orchestra here at this last part. So it started as just this one track. This is a fantastic patch where they sampled the cellos and basses playing in octaves naturally. Very fun. I use this patch all the time. And Pro Tools looks like it stopped recording. That is okay. I was just recording my dialogue as a backup here. I'm not going to worry too much about it because OBS is doing most of the work. So, but back to what I was saying about the composition. So this section here started as just this track, and these Albion samples are captured in the big hall layer, and they're very big sounding. So I like to layer on more of a studio sound. So this is the low strings from the Bernard Herrmann library. Same idea, strings playing in octaves, just a much tighter kind of sound. And when you put them together, you get this really defined sound that I prefer. And it's cinematic to me and exciting. So the Albion is the bulk of that sound. It's big and heavy, but this Bernard Herrmann patch adds quite a bit of definition to that. So on its own, you might not like that. I like it, but it's a little stringy sounding and a little dry, but that's why it's powerful, because that dryness adds a lot of clarity to this really big ambient patch. And I'm only using the tree microphones. I'm not doing anything crazy. I only have so much RAM to use on this computer, so I just use the tree microphones, nothing too fancy anymore. And, just using the tree mics and blending the sounds together. And then here, I have a patch that it's from this drama library, which is interesting. You can barely hear it, right? So that's all that patch is doing. But I'm telling you, it makes a big difference when you just layer little things like that in there. Because that's what real strings sound like when multiple people are playing. So this is all 3 strings together. And after we get our ensemble parts down, I went out and I took those parts and I put it on a dedicated cello and bass section. And these are drier studio samples, and when you put all of them together, you get this really powerful sound that I think is exciting and cinematic and good for the audience. So this whole score is kind of this combination of sampled strings and lots of synthesizers. And I think that makes it very fun. And then there's some more violin parts. And it's good to let... So these violin parts here at the end were inspired by this little sample right here. So one of my favorite techniques, I know string players don't like using it, is Colanio, and it's where you take the back of the bow and hit the strings with it. And that's what this is. I think I use Colanio. Yep, Colanio. So you can see how Logic is triggering the sounds on the PC computer. And then these sounds from the PC are going back into Logic, into the mixing board, into here. So that violin part might seem like it's not very important on its own, but film scoring is all about context, and I think in the context of this piece, it adds a lot of tension, and it adds a lot of dynamics and tension, and creates a lot of kind of angst, which is what I wanted to do in this one. So, yeah, so that's the piece for this week. So the reason I showed this is to show you how I build tracks and to emphasize the idea that, once again, that composition for media is this combination of composition and music production and technical skill, which is something I've talked about a lot. So when you're thinking about a piece, think about the notes and the harmony that you're using and what kind of feeling that evokes, but also think about the how are you organizing sounds to make that feeling, to emphasize those feelings that are intended by your composition. So what I like to do to close this out is I want to talk about something your classmate Max asked. He asked about a thing called chord triggers, and I think this is actually a great way to generate ideas. So if you're in any DAW, if you go to, there's MIDI plugins and audio plugins. Go to MIDI plugins. These are plugins that don't affect the audio signal, but just affect the MIDI notes that are going in or out of your sequencer. So what Max asked was how you set up chord triggers. So in Logic, if you set up the chord trigger, if you go to Learn, you can tell this plugin what chords you want to play, and then you can play back the chords with one trigger. I need to go into Learn and play C major 7. And now this C3 note is going to become a trigger that plays all of these notes. So if I wanted to harmonize the C major scale, you could do that. And now that you've taught the plugin that these are your trigger keys, you can take one finger and play C major. Or another cool thing you can do is you can experiment with chords on top of each other and see how that sounds. So to review, if I wanted to add some lower chords to this, what you could do is you put the plugin into Learn mode and you play the chords you want. So now I'm going to harmonize C major 1 octave below. And this is what it sounds like. So one of the benefits of this is that for those of you who are not explicitly keyboard players like myself, this lets you experiment with bigger chords. Simply, it lets you focus on the compositional intent of your piece. And it also lets you experiment with harmony you might not otherwise use. So you might experiment with the D minor with F major on top, E minor. So you can experiment in all kinds of ways like that. So to review how you set up this plugin, you go into here, into MIDI plugins, you go to chord trigger, then you go to learn to teach it the chords you want to play. So let's say this time I want to do A minor 7, A major 7 with the G, F major 7, G 7, back to A minor 7. So now I've taught it, those are the chords I want to hear on these notes. So you can basically create a whole piece using a plugin like this. And, I think if you actually record the MIDI with it, it'll also, I wonder if it'll actually put the notes in. We'll find out. Let's see. So no, it just plays back the notes that way. So this is actually a really cool idea. I'm glad Max brought that up, and I encourage you all to experiment, because now we have a chord progression I might not have otherwise come up with on my own. So that's always fun. So I encourage you all to experiment with that. And building off what Max is saying, I think another cool thing you could do if you're interested in using MIDI plugins is you can experiment with using an arpeggiator, and this can help you generate all kinds of ideas. So this is going to control the direction of the arpeggio. And it's going to be locked to the tempo that's up here in your piece. So if you go into latch mode, it's going to hold whatever you do, which is actually kind of cool. So that's another fun tool you can use to kind of come up with ideas if you're getting stuck on things, or you're just trying to experiment a little bit more. So, all right, well, I think that basically sums up our first work from home AVPA media music lesson. I hope that was insightful, and the takeaway from today was, whenever you start a project, I know some of you still working on your Sony films, you're probably pretty deep, but I like to start with this idea where I'm just sketching out the ideas first, and you can take those ideas and turn them into the final score. So the whole point of this was to experiment with different ways of working and try out new things. So I hope you all have a great start to your weekend. Happy Friday, and we will talk soon, and keep an eye out for the email updates that I send. So thanks, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.